So we start with a short film this session.
The River Erne flows through Upper and Lower Lough Erne between County Leitrim and County Fermanagh before it finally flows into Upper Lough Erne. County Fermanagh is full of lochs and rivers, and many of the children in our schools live near to Erne River or the streams, rivers and lakes that feed it. The Erne River is a beautiful, clean river.
The area that surrounds the Erne River is called the catchment and is an area of low hills. We visited one of the tributaries called the Dakota River, which flows out of the Marble Arch Caves. The Marble Arch Geopark is only 5 miles from our schools and is right beside Culca Mountain. Together they are very special because of the rock formations and the wildlife living there. We went to see the Marble Arch Caves and went to see more of the stalactites and other formations.
The Erne River is full of trout and perch, but every year salmon and roach swim for hundreds of miles to come and lay their eggs there. When we were at the Dakota River, we saw a salmon's tail that had been eaten by an otter. When we went to the river, we did some science. We measured how wide and how deep the river was and how fast it was going at that point. Because the water is so clean, when we did our kick sampling, we found lots and lots of bugs. Freshwater shrimp, mayfly larvae and case caddisfly larvae. These show us that the rivers are healthy and full of food for the fish.
We stand on our back up the river. Lots of wee creatures. So that's what oh, you'll not need more water, you're grand with that.
Look at this place.
Think of another cased caddisfly larva there. Look, see it? The wee tube of stones. Just there. So that's one.
I live in Cleshire and I love being beside the Erne River. We learned lots about rivers and where our water comes with catchment care. But we learned that sometimes we don't look after the river properly. Towns, farming and industry sometimes use our river as an easy way to get rid of rubbish we can see and chemicals we can't. What happens to all those little bugs then? And the fish, the roach and the salmon that have travelled so far to be here? What happens to the otters and the other animals that use the river for food and water?
We explored the river above ground and below ground, so we are going to look after our river. The river will be here in the future and we want lots of wildlife to use it too. Will you help us look after it?
So that video really embodies what we intended for this session, which was to actually hear from some young people. So that was primary school children from the Erne catchment. And again, what they said there at the end really captures it. You know, can you help us look after it? They're taking on the mantle, the next generation, caring for the rivers and the lochs in their areas. So with that in mind, we've got two speakers this afternoon in this session. So we've got Dakota Reid, who's a conservation officer with the RSPB, and then we've got Emily Chittenden from the Broads Authority talking about her work with youth engagement. So if I can ask Dakota to come up to the stage, Dakota's got her presentation first. Over to you.
Thanks, Dan. So I am quite a bit older than the kids in that video, but still qualify as a young person. So I want to talk a bit about saving nature for future generations. It's something I'm really passionate about, and I wanted to continue the theme that we heard earlier of that sort of storytelling and getting people inspired to fight for nature through that lens. So to start with, why am I talking about this? Is nature in crisis? You know, we go out to beautiful Lough Erne and we see lots of fantastic, amazing species, but we have sort of lost sight of the fact that we have lost so much in terms of our wildlife. So we are the 12th worst country in the world for biodiversity loss. That's out of 240 countries and territories. So when we think about nature loss, we often think about deforestation in the Amazon or the bleaching of the coral reefs that we're seeing in live time. We're seeing that really obvious destruction of nature. But actually, what we have lost closer to home is even more stark, but it's happened over a much longer time period. And whenever we're talking about climate, we often use sort of terminology around carbon neutral, carbon positive, and adapting this language for nature can sometimes be quite helpful. So this idea of moving towards nature positive, so it's not just stopping the devastating loss of nature, which we're all witnessing at the moment, but actually getting back up to the point of recovery that where nature would have been before. So we're going to try and do a bit of Slido if the technology works. So it should be the same link from earlier. But I wanted to get a sense of this idea of shifting baseline syndrome. So effectively, it's the idea that where we have sort of lost sight of just how much nature we have actually lost in this country. So whenever people talk about the species that they see here, and it's fantastic to have such sort of a range of generations in the room today who remember our freshwater landscapes in this way. Sometimes there's some of these species that I possibly haven't even seen in my local area. So I know whenever my grandparents moved to the area where I grew up, they talked about seeing yellowhammer, and I have never seen yellowhammer in that part of County Antrim in my life. And it wouldn't be something that I would notice the loss of, except that I have never, except that I know that other generations have seen it in the past. So this idea is that generations, my own, the generations coming after us, don't actually realise how nature depleted we are. So I think if we switch to presenter mode, I should be able to see the questions come up. So I'm not sure if the first question has come up yet. It has. So the first question is asking, so by local area, sort of defining that as not just your garden or the closest park to you, but maybe the areas you go for walks on, sort of in and around where you live. So very interesting to see such a large proportion of people have seen a grey heron in the last year in their local area, and that's brilliant to see because they're a beautiful, beautiful bird. So I think moving on to the next question, do I have to click it or is it? Perfect, okay. So another species, the same again, so skylark would have been found in a lot of farmland across Ireland, across the UK and Ireland, hay meadows, but also upland habitats. So a bit more mixed, not quite as many people have seen one in the last year in their local area. So I haven't seen one in the last year in my local area, unfortunately. It's a species that's really become very depleted with our changing farming practices, but a lot of the farmers that we're working with in RSPB have seen them recover on their lands through sensitive management for nature. And I think we'll move on to the last question. So again, in your local area, here we go, yes, the beautiful charismatic corncrake. I say beautiful, you're unlikely to see it, but you probably will hear it. So I have never seen one in my local area because I come from the southern part of County Antrim and they're only left in the northern part. Only 3 call-in pairs or call-in males. So yeah, as we see there, a lot of people have said that they've never seen one in their local area. So that hopefully, if you were to go back maybe 60 years or so, all of those species you would expect to find in and around our freshwater habitats, in and around our farmlands. So that hopefully demonstrates sort of how we're probably not feeling the loss of corncrake from our own local area because we don't remember it. And it's interesting talking to farmers on Rathlin Island who said about it used to be deafening, the sound of the corncrake, and they're very lucky that it's still clinging on there. But in a lot of other parts of the country, we're coming to the point where the generations that are farming the land possibly don't even remember these species being there anymore. So why do we actually need nature? So it's not, hopefully I shouldn't have to convince everyone here that something like the, amazing song of the skylark or the sight of a kingfisher on our freshwaters is worth saving, but because of the ecosystem services on which we depend, we actually really, really need nature if we're to survive as a species ourselves. Nature offers us so many benefits, everything from flood prevention, stopping devastating flooding, which we know we're going to see more because of climate change, improving our air quality, improving our water quality, but also the carbon sequestration, which we're talking about more in that context of nature-based solutions. And then, of course, the physical and mental health benefits, which I'm sure a lot of people have experienced. And just to give a bit of context to my own story with engaging with nature, I've always been interested in nature growing up, but it was whenever I sort of started volunteering that I got to sort of get up close and personal with a lot of these habitats a bit more. I'm personally very interested in birds, of course, working for the RSPB. Might be fired if I said I wasn't, but I'm a very keen entomologist as well, so very interested in recording butterflies and moths and dragonflies, damselflies, bees, wasps, whatever I can have a go at. And for me, it's especially during COVID, it was really, really important for me to have that time outside and to get to grips with some new groups of species that I hadn't got to identify before. And that was a lifeline for me during COVID. I recorded 150 species of moth in my garden during the pandemic. That might be more of a sign of madness than keeping myself sane, but it was really, really rewarding. And I think it's really important that everyone gets that access to nature and that everyone, gets to not just get out to nature reserves growing up, but sees this actually on their doorstep, that they're on their doorstep, they're seeing all of the fantastic species that we should have close to home in our local areas. And our freshwaters in Northern Ireland, as we've already talked about today, are so, so precious. We know that they're significant on an international level, with a lot of them being internationally designated. Lough Erne, for example, and I will talk a bit about Lough Erne because that's the one that I'm most familiar with, having sort of worked on a placement at our Lough Erne reserves up there, and it's sort of been the biggest freshwater body in the UK and Ireland. It's really significant to a lot of people, and it's obviously been in the news a lot. We know, and I think most of us in the room probably already knew it, but I think I can't deny it anymore, that we know we have to protect them. They're not always going to be there, and we need to be mindful of how we're managing them, how we're treating them. They're not an endless resource for us to take advantage of without considering the long-term management. So it is worth protecting. We all know it's worth protecting these species for future generations, but they won't be here forever if we don't protect them. So the likes of the marsh fritillary butterfly here and the Irish damselfly, so these are both species I photographed at our Munchies Moss Reserve, which is one of our newest RSPB reserves over in Lough Erne. And we are very lucky to be the custodians of so many fantastic freshwater habitats and wetlands right across Northern Ireland, including around Lough Erne and Lough Erne. And these species are clinging on. They need specific management. They're species that you've got people travelling far and wide to come and see, and the likes of the marsh fritillary specifically is, I think, one of the most charismatic species of insects that we've got, and we're very lucky to have the last remaining fragments of them around Lough Erne and Lough Erne, but they won't always be there unless we protect them. So just to sort of sum up, we have so much amazing wildlife on our doorsteps, but not as much as we maybe did in the past in terms of these species actually being close to home for us and people growing up with these species and seeing them and being familiar with them in their local area. I think that it's really important that we are clear about the problem that we face. I think it's very important that we shout loudly about the science, about just what a dire state nature is in. But I think it's actually really important that we also sell a vision that's worth fighting for, that's worth working towards, and that's worth bringing young people on board for. Mindful of eco-anxiety, which is something that is definitely more in the public consciousness these days than it used to be. People find reading this news sometimes really, really difficult. So I think it does need to be balanced out with the realism that comes from the science, but also visioning what are we actually working towards. And sometimes we have to look back in the past to do that. So I think that's why today has been so fantastic, hearing the stories of people who have grown up around Lough Erne and what wildlife they remember and how they remember engaging with these habitats. Because we need to know what is it that we're trying to work towards, what is it that we're trying to sell to policymakers, to the general public, to the next generation coming along. You know, they need to hear us speak passionately about what we're trying to get. You know, these lowland raised bogs that are rich in colour from the sphagnum mosses and the bog asphodel, and, you know, the air buzzing with dragonflies and damselflies, or if it's the freshwater islands that are rich with our breeding waders. They may have disappeared before but are returning now. You've got the fantastic peewit call of the lapwing or the bubbling call of the curlew. But we need to describe these things with passion and engage the next generation and want them to love these things too and fight for them. And it comes back to that David Attenborough quote again that was shared earlier. People need to experience these things for themselves to fight for it. But thank you very much, and I look forward to speaking to people later and hearing ideas about how we can better engage with young people in order to save nature together, because it's going to take all of us, and we're trying to do it for the next generation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dakota. So we're not going to have questions in this session because we're saving all that for the session from 2 o'clock, where we've got the more dynamic and active discussions in the breakout rooms. So remember what Dakota said. If that sparked things, make a note of it, because you can speak to Dakota direct in the next sessions. So next up, we have Emily Chittenden, and Emily's going to go through her experiences of engaging with young people in the Broads. Thank you, Emily.
Is there another presentation which is about the Broads? Yeah. I mean, I could try and talk about tackling inequality. That really would be putting me on the spot, I think. Whilst they're just sorting that out, it's lovely to be here. I come from the furthest easterly point of England, so to fly over here and fly over some of your lochs and be so close to this amazing place has been absolutely fantastic. So I come from the flatlands. We're very simple in Norfolk and Suffolk. You have your lochs here, the UKILNs in Wales. We just call them the Broads, basically because they're broader than the river, because that's as simple as we get. The Broads National Park, a huge, largest protected UK wetland, and I feel very privileged to be part of members of the team that help protect that special place. So I'm one of the ecologists in the Broads National Park, but I've spent the previous 25 years delivering sort of youth engagement projects, trying to help young people value and appreciate nature as much as we all do in this room, both in freshwater and coastal environments. I thought I would focus very much on connections, and I've got two sort of case studies to share with you about how we feel connections are some of the most important parts of successfully delivering youth engagement projects. We've talked a lot about connections and collaborations already today, and as the last speaker, you've pretty much done my job for me, so I can just show you some pretty pictures and talk a bit around the pictures. So one of the first projects that we've been working on in the Broads National Park was called Generation Green. Does that exist in Northern Ireland? Does it ring any bells with anybody? I think it was probably just in England and Wales. And it was a project which aimed to get 8 to 25-year-olds out into nature, particularly those groups of people that wouldn't normally have access to the natural environment. So it's very much focusing on improving diversity of access to nature and inspiring young people to take up green careers. So we did a huge amount of activities out in the Broads National Park. We felt it was very important that they get onto the water, so we did lots of canoeing, paddle boarding, but also to take part in some of the conservation activities of how we protect the landscape. The furthest right, this gentleman up here, Nick Sanson, our education officer, he loves getting underneath the ground as well, so he will show groups peat and what's actually happening underneath our reed beds. I felt quite proud that we managed to engage over 500 primary school children in the programme in the Broads, and then I saw that LELP had got 7,696. We only had 3 months though, so I think if I scale that up, I don't think we did too badly. And that's with 2 education officers trying to engage these groups. So we managed to bring out sort of about 500 primary school children out into the Broads and over 63 teenagers to places that they wouldn't normally get to explore. Second project, real mouthful. Rails, Sails and Trails. I didn't make up the title, I was just engaged to deliver the project. This was a really interesting project. It was a locally funded project rather than a nationally funded one. And this was trying to get primary school children in particular out onto the railways into our national park. So getting to the Broads but from a very different angle. So I'll talk a little bit more about how connections are important in that project as well. One of the other themes of Rails, Sails and Trails was looking at how our traditional boats called the wherries, there's a picture of one up on the screen there, how that was gradually displaced by the railways over time in moving goods and services throughout the national park. So, first connection. For those of you that aren't familiar with the Broads National Park, it's to the furthest side of eastern England. It's a strange-shaped national park. It's a bit like a hand with fingers. It's made up of 7 river valleys that all sort of coalesce to the east, a place called Great Yarmouth, through the estuary called Braden Water. I must point out that I've put the largest wetland, it's the largest protected wetland in the UK. And one of the connections we'd like the young people to try and understand is how connected the river valleys are. So we worked with groups from Norwich, which is the biggest city, plus groups from Great Yarmouth and Lowestoft. And we were trying to emphasise that if you live in Great Yarmouth, you only have to sort of step towards your most local river and you're then connected to 125 miles of waterway. You're connected within that huge protected area. For a lot of the young people, particularly those in Great Yarmouth, they hadn't really stepped out of Great Yarmouth. In 14 years, they didn't know there was a national park on the doorstep. They saw their river as a barrier to getting any further. We tried to suggest that the river was a conduit to go and explore these amazing places. Again, this is sort of an aerial view of... Oh, zipped ahead, sorry. A typical sort of Broads National Park landscape. So the second connection we would like these young people to understand when they come out is water underpins everything that's happening in the national park, including the habitats either side of the water bodies. So we have 63 Broads, which we might consider as stillwater, 7 flowing rivers, plus all of these small dikes or ditches that connect all of those water bodies together. So we really try and emphasise those ecological interactions as well, and how those habitats support some of our rarest species. And then, of course, the main purpose of what we're doing is trying to help these young people personally connect with these very special places. I have to put poo on the slide because I'm an ecologist, and as Laura had already introduced through her animation, there's water vole poop at the top on the left there. So some of the activities we did involve taking the young people out surveying. So they're basically doing my job, so shadowing me as an ecologist. We introduced them to our herd of grazing ponies, the conic ponies. We do a lot of pond dipping, sampling in the water, getting them as close as we can to their surroundings, and then they also help us actually manage parts of the fenland in various ways. So the more mucky we can get them, the more hands-on we can get them, the closer we can get them to nature, the stronger that personal connection is. One of our guiding principles is if a child says, "So what?" we might be able to provide an answer for them through their experience. So trying to make it relevant to their lives. We had a group from Norwich, so the furthest west, and we said, if you put a bit of litter in the river there, a child in Great Yarmouth might pick that up. Or if we pollute this river, we're going to potentially pollute the whole 125 miles. So trying to make those connections and how it's relevant to them. We couldn't do any of this without our local partners. We've talked a lot about collaboration today, and our education officer, his quote was, "We would be helpless without our local partners," and I think that's very true. Our volunteers are vital to the success in our delivery of these projects. We've talked a little bit about intergenerational exchange and stories and generations sharing their experiences, and some of our volunteers are now retired people who work with our young people, not only to help them in the tasks that they're doing, but to share their stories of why a place is special. The youth workers, trying to reach out to those groups that wouldn't normally come out to the national park is incredibly difficult, and we talked a bit about that this morning. How do you, first of all, recruit those groups? We don't even know where they are sometimes, but we do have good links with youth workers, and they can then connect us with the groups that they feel would most benefit from coming out with us into the national park. So our youth worker links are really critical. Schools, again, form a big cohort of the groups that come out, and without the support from the school teachers and the school leaders, we wouldn't be able to reach our 500 primary school children, or our 7,000 in the case of Northern Ireland. And then we also have lots of other outdoor education providers. So the Broads National Park, we have an education officer and volunteers. We don't own much land ourselves, but we do work in partnership with other sites. So we really value the partnerships we have with them. On the right-hand side, this is showing a group of young people how they could thatch a house. So they might have come out with us to cut down reed, and then that reed is taken to another provider, and they show them how they could actually put it to good use on a house. And for some of these people, it's sparking off the idea, well, I could be a thatcher, I could be a reed cutter, I could be a person that looks after livestock, I could be a grazier. If they're really daft, they might want to become an ecologist or an aquatic scientist, So I think exposing them to as many different experiences and different environments whilst they're with us is really important. National partners. So the Generation Green project was funded through the Green Recovery Fund, and it was a collaboration of various partners throughout England and Wales. And again, without that collaborative effort, we would have been able to reach so many of these young groups. So really vital. We've already touched on the importance of storytelling, art, singing. So for each of our projects, we might do a mix of scientific exercises, but we also try and work with local artists. So for some of these young people, they can interpret their landscape through art or voice. And in some cases, as it's National Poetry Day, occasionally we get to do some poetry with the young people. So Carter is age 9. This is his haiku that he generated from a trip out to the Norfolk Broads. We haven't adjusted any of the spelling either, so some of the things are quite interesting. But the pillars that you can see in that slide formed part of an installation outside our library in Norwich. And they're these big stone pillars which had pictures of the Broads, writing about the Broads. And when it was being developed, I put my hand up and said, but there's nothing from the young people. Their voice isn't on these pillars at all. And then stupidly they said, well, can you go and collect those young voices? And I thought, what's the best way to do it? Get them to write something, draw something. So now their artwork is also on those pillars. So trying to engage or help those young people interpret their experience in different ways has also been really, really interesting. One of the best outcomes of the Generation Green project is that each national park nominated 1 or 2 youth ambassadors, or young people volunteered to become a youth ambassador for their national park. And at the end of the project, they all came together at a big Youth Voice conference in the Peak District. And this was the summary, I don't know what you call it, they've got a name, haven't they, when there was an artist that was basically drawing up everything live as the young people were talking, and this is the final outcome. And for me, I've circled it in the middle. One of the things that the young people said was, give us a toolkit. They came up with some fantastic ideas, but they said, you know, there are barriers that we face as young people to try and make a difference. So within their toolkit, what they asked for was more funds to achieve things. They wanted the support and advice that we've started them off with to always be there. So if they needed help, they could come and ask us. They said actually getting to the special places, whether they're lakes, woodlands, reed beds, was really difficult. So transport, making sure there was transport for them to experience these things. The RSPB were doing a really good thing of youth entrance, so making it free to these young people. Because some of these protected sites, obviously, they have to pay to come into. The other thing that they said was sometimes a barrier, they didn't feel very confident or welcome in the outdoor spaces. So if there's ways that we can signpost them, I think in the Broads National Park we do quite well. As an authority, we've got some young apprentices right up to our wardens who've been there for 50 years, just to show that, you know, everybody is welcome and everybody can work in these environments. And then finally, what they really wanted was a platform or forum from which their young voices could be heard, because that's the other difficulty, is how they've got fantastic ideas, but how is anybody listening to what they're saying? So I think in summary, I would say that if you can get the connections right and get those things in place, the young people will eventually take ownership, which is really good. And we as providers can step back a bit and let the next generation take things forward. That's it.